Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today at ISA's seminar titled Structure and Dynamics of the Sri Lanka Peace Process. This seminar will explore critical examination of the peace process, focus on key structural and strategic weaknesses. This discussion will also address flaws in the ceasefire agreement, disputes over high security zones and naval clashes between the Sri Lankan Navy and the Sea Tigers. Today, we are delighted to have with us Professor G.L. Perez, Sri Lanka's former Minister of External Affairs and Emeritus Professor of Law, University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. Today's session will be chaired by Associate Professor Dr. Iqbal Singh Sivia, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. Today's session will also be live streamed on the ISA's Facebook page. I shall now invite Dr. Iqbal to commence the discussion.
Thank you, Tanuja. Professor Perez, former Minister of External Affairs, Sri Lanka. Friends, colleagues, on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, I welcome you to this seminar entitled Structure and Dynamics of the Sri Lanka Peace Process. After decades of militancy and civil war, the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or LTTE, negotiated a ceasefire in 2002 and began a difficult process of negotiating a solution to a conflict that resulted in the loss of tens of thousands of lives. Talks began in Thailand on 16 September 2002, and there was a lot of international attention and hopes were high that a permanent solution could be shaped. There was, to be sure, a period of relative peace that followed the declaration of the ceasefire. However, shaping a permanent solution proved to be much more difficult than negotiating a ceasefire. There were numerous factors that complicated the shaping of a political solution. This ranged from who and which parties were involved, which issues were prioritized in the negotiations. And there were also competing agendas that came to the fore. But I would also suggest that there seemed to be a lack of clarity over possible political frameworks that all sides were willing to agree upon. And one of the questions I hope we get to hear about is whether there was a vision of an end game, say, from both sides. At the same time, I would like to highlight here as well, then I'm sure Professor Perez will be discussing this, is that there was an important role played or not played by regional powers and international actors. And therefore, we need to focus on the international community, not just countries, but also non-state actors such as the donors who were involved in various stages of the process as well. Eventually, the peace process collapsed and Sri Lanka witnessed a return to violence and a subsequent military solution ended the issue. Now, despite the peace process not living up to the hopes that it generated, there are important lessons that we can learn from the negotiation process, and important insights can be gleaned from it. Among these are I'll just name a few that came to my mind, is that how peace processes and negotiation need to be structured, how competing interests need to and can be managed or prove difficult to manage. What are the pitfalls that we need to bear in mind, and the bearing that wider geopolitical context has on peace processes, particularly with regards to smaller states surrounded by larger actors. These questions, I'm sure none of us is living under a rock. These questions are particularly salient today with the crises going around across the world. And in this sense, the publication of Professor Perez's latest book is very timely and important. I think this seminar will provide a lot for us to think about, to chew on, and to discuss as well. Professor Perez's new book, entitled The Sri Lanka Peace Process: An Inside View. The title itself, I think, is very important, Inside View, because it does indeed provide us with an insider's account to how the peace process played out. Because Professor Perez led the government of Sri Lanka's delegation in 6 rounds of peace talks with the LTTE between September 2002 and March 2003. I don't want to say much any more of the book because I'm here to hear from Professor Perez and engage him in the discussion as well. But I'd like to highlight some of the a little bit about who Professor Perez is, and it's always a difficult thing to introduce someone that everybody already knows, and there's so much to say. I could spend 20 minutes on this, so I'll try and sum it up in 2 minutes if I can. Professor G.L. Perez is an emeritus professor of law at the University of Colombo and a distinguished academic and public servant. Professor Pires has held a wide range of ministerial portfolios over the years, including education, external affairs, justice and constitutional affairs, export development and international trade, ethnic affairs and national integration, enterprise development, investment promotion and industrial policy, industrial development, and finance as deputy minister. He has been a member of parliament since 1994, and he has served as the chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Committee on Constitutional Reforms. As if that was not enough, he also has a very distinguished academic career. Professor Pires obtained his Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford in 1971 and has had an illustrious career as an academic. He has published over 12 books and more than 75 scholarly articles, which have been published in international journals, and is here to talk about his latest publication, The Sri Lanka Peace Process, an Inside View, which was published last year. Professor Pires, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to ISS, because you've been here a number of times. But it's my first opportunity to meet with you. And like everybody else, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and having an engaging session tomorrow. Yeah. Professor Pires, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Well, for this cordial welcome and for your generous introduction. I'm not really a stranger to the Institute of South Asian Studies. I have been here on many occasions during the last 15, 20 years. And I think when I was a foreign minister, we also entered into a memorandum of understanding with your institute. So may I thank you again. And your able deputy, Dr. Heinik, with whom I have engaged in correspondence regarding this event. Now, as we meet here, there are dramatic changes taking place in the world order. I was listening to President Trump this morning, and he made the announcement that there is going to be world peace through strength. Now, that is a new paradigm. And the United States has been instrumental in putting together the major components of the international architecture as we know it today in many spheres. In world trade, we had the WTO, the Human Rights Council in Geneva. The United States has been active in international trade, in climate change, and so on. And what we now see is not just a tweaking of those systems in keeping with contemporary priorities and requirements, but indeed a complete overhaul of the system, an erosion of the foundations of the system, which has been built up over the years since World War II. And the most prominent characteristic of the changes is, of course, that the international order is not going to be rules-based anymore. It's going to be rules-based. Legitimacy is going to be an issue because impulse and caprice are going to replace a settled normative order. So it is in that context that we are discussing the peace process in Sri Lanka. And what I would like to discuss is what we were able to achieve through that process, where we failed, were there any inherent deficiencies in the structure and dynamics of the process. And I will make a few comments on the matters which Dr. Iqbal referred to, whether there was an end game and the role of global and regional players in particular, by which, as I said, we mean not only sovereign states, but also donors. There was the very impressive donor conference in Tokyo in June 2003, at which 51 sovereign states and 23 international organizations participated. There were high expectations, many of which were unfortunately not fulfilled, and worth examining the reasons. Of course, no peace process, we can't copy a peace process in one country. No two situations are identical. But I think there are lessons to be learned and suitably adapted to other circumstances. It is an experience worth reflecting on. I will go through some of the main features of the Sri Lankan peace process. Before the face-to-face talks started between the government of Sri Lanka and the LTTE. There were some matters which had to be addressed at the threshold. One was, is it possible to engage in peace discussions with an organization which has been banned, proscribed? Because at the time this initiative was embarked upon, the LTTE was, of course, a proscribed organization in Sri Lanka. And Vedupillai Prabhakaran steadfastly refused to engage the government of Sri Lanka unless and until the ban was removed. President Kumaratunga was of opinion that that was not necessary. Indeed, it would be counterproductive, in her opinion. And her position was there would be the deproscription, but that would occur only when substantial progress had been made in the peace talks over a reasonable time. Until then, she was not prepared to lift the ban on the LTTE. That was the stand of President Kumaratunga. Then the ceasefire agreement was entered into after some of these problems were resolved. The other issue was whether we were going to use a foreign party as a mediator or facilitator. Now, Kumaratunga was elected Prime Minister in September 1994, and as soon as she was elected, she did embark upon peace talks. She sent her envoys to Jaffna to talk to the representatives of the LTTE. At that time, there was no mediator or facilitator, and those talks broke down. Later on, when she became president in November 1994, and a couple of years later, Ranil Wickremesinghe became Prime Minister, it was felt that some form of facilitation was necessary to take the peace process forward. So some thought was given to who the facilitator would be. And Norway was selected for many reasons, one of which was that Norway was not a major political or economic actor in the Indian Ocean region. India in particular was not comfortable with a powerful country playing a mediating role in the Sri Lankan peace process. Norway was no stranger to Sri Lanka. Today, if you talk to any Sri Lankan, Norway is associated with the peace process, but long before they got involved in the peace process, they were active, particularly in the southern province of Sri Lanka, in road development, support for small and medium sector industries and so on. So Norway was familiar with the nuances of the country. Norway was chosen. The low profile of Norway was one of the significant reasons for the choice of Norway, the Norwegian government. But later on, that turned out to be a disadvantage, especially after 9/11 and the international environment became very forbidding. Norway felt the need for involvement by countries with more muscle. And Norway at that point proposed the mechanism of co-chairs. The United States, the European Union, Japan, and Norway. But by that time, the appetite for involvement in the peace process had waned. So the relatively unobtrusive profile of Norway was a double-edged thing. It had its strengths as well as its disadvantages. On the role of different countries, the United States was in a very strange, a very unusual position, because in terms of US law, the US government could not engage in any manner whatsoever with the LTTE, because in 1997, the US banned the LTTE. The LTTE was one of 30 organizations which were named in 1997 as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs. So by law, the US was precluded from any form of engagement with the LTTE. But the Deputy Secretary of State at the time was Richard Armitage, who took a particular interest in Sri Lankan issues. He had been sent by President Ronald Reagan to Sri Lanka in 1983 when there were serious disturbances on the island. And ever since then, Richard Armitage took a very vigorous, a very active interest in Sri Lankan affairs. It was personal, it was nothing to do with his office. So much so that the Sri Lankan ambassador to Washington at that time, Devendra Subhasinghe, told us that Armitage was affectionately referred to in Washington as a Sri Lanka desk officer. He was so involved in the minutiae of the Sri Lankan situation. So he took an approach that was quite unorthodox. He did not consider himself constrained by US law, but he adopted the attitude that that was not to be understood as the permanent US position. The LTT is outlawed completely beyond the pale. Can't talk to them. That was not his approach at all. He wanted the LTT to understand that if they change their behavior, not just prior statements about their aspirations, but if there was tangible evidence of a change in their code of conduct, then the US would be more than happy to consider lifting the ban on the LTT. So his policy was one of active and continuing encouragement. Shed your views, not so much your views as your behavior, and then we will look at you in a different light. So much so that in November 2002, when there was a donor conference in Oslo, Armitage decided to attend the conference. So he was attending the conference at which a participant would be the representative of Mr. Prabhakar, on the face of it entirely incompatible with US policy. But he made that decision. And what is more, he remained in the room when Dr. Anton Balasingham, representing Prabhakaran, made his address. He did not walk out. He stayed in the room to listen to the speech that was delivered by Dr. Anton Balasingham. So there were these strange contradictions and inconsistencies in US policy at that time. With regard to India, India had invested a lot of time and effort in the constitutional arrangements which they thought were appropriate for our country. We had the 1987 Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, and out of which there emanated the 13th Amendment to Sri Lanka's constitution. So for the first time in our constitutional history, there was a demarcation of powers between the center and the periphery. And this line of demarcation was established by the paramount law of the country, the Constitution. President Jayawardena appealed to the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi of India. He said, my government has to deal with two insurrections, one in the north, one in the south. I do not have the military muscle to do that. And it is your duty as the leader of a democratic government in South Asia to prevent my government from being overthrown by violent movements. The Indian response was, yes, certainly, but not unconditional. Before we agree to send Indian troops onto the island, there must be firm guarantees of for the protection of minority rights. So the 13th Amendment grew out of that understanding between President Jayawardena and the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. So the Indian approach was something like this, that India wanted very much to see these arrangements which they had worked so hard on implemented on the ground in Sri Lanka. But the LTT could not be a player at that time. India did not want the LTT to be an active participant in the constitutional arrangements. They had no faith at all in the LTT, and there was, of course, a great deal of rancor and acrimony growing out of the LTT's assassination of Rajiv Gandhi. So after that, the Indian attitude was very hostile to the LTT. They wanted their work to be reflected in the arrangements that were implemented on the ground, but without the participation of the LTT. So the LTT had to be eliminated before that time. Nevertheless, India could not be seen to be playing a role at all in the elimination of the LTT because of the dynamics of the politics of South India. So it was clear what they wanted, but they themselves would not make an active contribution to promoting the result, which was very much derived by them. So India would not for a moment consider being one of the co-chairs. They did not want to be officially associated with the process at all, although they were kept informed at all times. Kept informed by the Sri Lankan government at all times. We spoke to the Indian High Commissioner, we visited Delhi, we met the foreign minister, and they were fully in the loop. Then Japan played a major role, particularly on the economic side. But there was a difference in attitude on the part of Japan, which had a point of view which could be easily distinguished from the views of the other co-chairs. The co-chairs, when they met in Tokyo, as I said, in June 2003, came up with very substantial pledges. Some of the largest pledges in Sri Lanka's post-independent history. They pledged $4.5 billion to be delivered to Sri Lanka within a period of 4 years, but on condition that there was substantial progress with regard to the core political issues. Paragraph 18 of the communique which came out of Tokyo referred to conditionality. So the availability of economic resources was dependent upon substantial progress with regard to political issues. Now, how do you interpret conditionality? Countries like the United States wanted clear proof of movement forwards. But Japan took a different view. Japan said, we have had a very close relationship with Sri Lanka since independence, the Colombo plan. For a very long period, Japan was Ceylon's largest donor. And they did not wish to be constricted by criteria imposed upon them by any of the other projects. So say we will be sui generis in this issue. And it is because of Japan's benign influence that the other co-chairs were prevented from imposing on Sri Lanka certain straitjacket arrangements with regard to progress in respect of political issues. So we had the co-chairs, but there was certainly no homogeneity. There were significant difference of approach among the co-chairs. And that mechanism did not really deliver on the ground. The European Union, Chris Patten, came to Sri Lanka, went to the Vanni to meet Prabhakaran. It happened to be on Prabhakaran's birthday. He did not have the support of all the countries in the European Union. France, for example, had significant regulation. The EU banned the LTT in 2006. And after that, it was difficult for even a venue in Europe to be found for discussions between the government and the LTT. And the only venue that was available after 2006 was Geneva. Dr. Iqbal referred to the economic side of it. Now, there, the end game, there were significant differences of approach between the government of Sri Lanka and the LTT. The approach of Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was that internationalization, the inclusion of resources and so on, all this was necessary because he was looking for an international safety net. If the process broke down at some point, vulnerability on the part of the government of Sri Lanka would be enhanced by a close rapport with the donors. So he wanted to develop those relationships, and in any case, it fell into place within the overall context of his policy regaining Sri Lanka, which placed very heavy emphasis on the acceleration of international trade, greater investment into the country, and so on. So Ranil Wickremesinghe, as Prime Minister, wanted a safety net. The LTT, for their part, also supported internationalization, but for different reasons. They were looking for legitimacy. In an organization which had been banned, the internationalization of the process gave them respectability, especially because the process was facilitated by a sovereign government, the royal Norwegian government. But things changed. The LTT at first was very enthusiastic about internationalization, but as the process moved forward, they felt that there was a certain element of entrapment. The donors were saying, yes, we are there to help you, but you must show significant progress. The LTT, as far as the Indian, that Dr. Iqbal referred to, the Indian was concerned, my strong impression as I read the Sri Lankan side in the negotiations with the Tamil Tigers was that the LTT were interested in one thing only. They were very, very interested in what is known as the ISG, the interim self-governing authority. They want to be interim self-governing authority established. Because they had established a de facto state in that area. They had their own police force, they had their own customs, they had their own banking system, and so on. So they wanted de jure recognition for something that they had already established. So the ISDA was very important. Now, the Sri Lankan government position was ISDA certainly in a conflict that has lasted so long, that has generated so much bad feeling, and there was so little trust between the parties, the ISDA was a necessary step in the arduous journey towards the final settlement. But it was interim. And it was acceptable only if there was a nexus between the ISDA and the final settlement. There must be some parity with regard to the progress that was contemplated post-ISDA, and how do you move towards the final settlement? Now, that is where the LTT proved completely intransigent. They were not interested in anything that was going to happen after the establishment of the ISDA. ISDA, as far as they were concerned. So this was one of the fundamental differences in approach between the government of Sri Lanka and the LTT. Then this feeling that economic resources were definitely going to help. See, the government of the day believed that the peace process would be very substantially strengthened by sentiment in the country of a peace dividend. That the lives of people, particularly in the north and the east, who had suffered so much for 30 years, their lives were going to be alleviated. Livelihoods, removal of ordnances, landmines, the ability to return to their homes. All of this was going to be greatly facilitated by the availability of substantial economic resources. So the idea of the economic dividend was central to the architecture of the Sri Lankan peace process. But that too proved to be very short-lived. The LTT felt that the international community, although at first they were aloof from both parties, equidistant from both parties, and there was objectivity. It was a dispassionate approach by the international community. But as the process moved forward, the LTT felt that the government was using the donors to compel the LTT to adopt positions which they considered detrimental to their overall cause. So LTT then became conscious of entrapment. They said they thought this was a trap. And they were then assiduous in trying to find ways of exiting the process. Because the infusion of resources, the influence of the donor community, and then there was also the perception up and down the country that this process was not just donor assisted, but donor driven. And that provoked a lot of nationalist sentiment against the peace process. Then there were one or two, I would like to make one or two other points briefly before I conclude. One of the basic problems about the structure of the process was that both the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE, for some of different reasons, wanted to recognize a kind of dichotomy in the sequencing of the process. They wanted to deal first with the what Anton Balasingham referred to as the existential issues. And we worked through a network of empowered subcommittees. The most crucial subcommittee was the subcommittee on immediate rehabilitation and humanitarian needs. So the conviction was that is where you need to begin. Make life easier for people who had been subjected to so much anguish and despair over so long a period. You start with the humanitarian and rehabilitation issues before you get to grips with the seemingly intractable political issues. Don't start with the political issues, because then there is a great danger that the entire process would break down in limine. So address the existential issues, try to give relief to people, and engender greater confidence in the peace process. Now, that did not work. That turned out to be one of the fundamental misconceptions, because it was found in the course of the functioning of the subcommittee on rehabilitation and humanitarian issues that if the politics of it remained intact, the constitutional structures, the administrative systems remained exactly as they were, then you could not make progress within that mold, in that structure. You could not make tangible progress with regard to the humanitarian and rehabilitation issues, because the expenditure of money had to be authorized by the Secretary of the Ministry of Public Administration. The bureaucrats, the public officials involved were less than totally enthusiastic about the goals and objectives of the process, because by that time, other things had begun to happen. So, and the other things were basically these. When the peace process started, there was 90% favorable sentiment about it. 90%. But not just in the north, but the people in the south also felt that this will succeed, this must succeed. We must ensure that it succeeds. So when the peace talks started in Sattahip, Thailand on the 16th of September 2002, there was considerable enthusiasm and even exhilaration in the country, but that broke down very rapidly for many reasons. One was the fact that the LTTE was seen, it was very obvious that they were abusing the ceasefire agreement. They were under cover of the ceasefire agreement. They were using the sea tigers to bring into the country large quantities of weapons. The Sri Lankan government, at the time the CFA was being drafted, told the facilitator, the Royal Norwegian government, that you must put in a provision with regard to sea tigers and the bringing of arms into the country. But the Norwegians were reluctant to do that because of the pressure that was exerted on them by the LTTE. You see, that again was an interesting issue. There was something special about the Norwegian involvement, that is the concept of ownership of the peace process. Ownership. In many other situations in which the Norwegians were involved, for example, Aceh, where former President Martti Ahtisaari of Finland played a significant role, there were UN agreements and UN directions and so on, which strengthened the Norwegians. But in this case, the authority derived exclusively from the agreement between the government and the LTT. So their position was, we can operate only within those parameters. So, although there was a great deal of enthusiasm initially, it broke down because of the feeling that the LTT was taking the government for a ride, pulling the wool over the eyes of the government. One major issue was child soldiers. By this time, there was a very considerable interest in this issue at the international level, and the Secretary General had created an office of representative of the Attorney General in respect of child soldiers. And Olara Otuno, who was the person appointed for that responsibility, visited Sri Lanka, and we had several very stimulating conversations with Olara Otuno. The LTT, in callous disregard of both the local and international opinion, was recruiting child soldiers without any sensitivity or restraint. And also, the Sri Lanka monitoring mission, in terms of the CFA, the function of monitoring lapses of the CFA was entrusted to the monitoring mission. Now, the very serious problems arose from the combination of these two roles. Norway was the facilitator. Norway was also the monitor. The head of the monitoring mission was a Norwegian. Now, the Sri Lanka monitoring mission proved to be totally ineffective. And there were situations where the members of the monitoring mission were struggling in the sea. They were thrown out. They were thrown out of ships and so on, and had to be picked up by the Sri Lankan Navy. So far from being able to monitor the ceasefire agreement, they had to struggle to save their own lives. So that that appearance of absolute impotence on the part of the institution that was supposed to be the watchdog resulted in a significant erosion of confidence in the ceasefire agreement as a whole. Now, the last point I want to make is with regard to what is known as the PTOMS agreement. PTOMS agreement. Now, this was the tsunami disaster, December Boxing Day, 26th of December 2004. A final attempt was made by the President Kumarapalli to salvage the process. Here was an unparalleled devastation, which took a particularly heavy toll on the eastern coastline of the country. And President Kumarapalli's view was, here is an opportunity for the government to work with the LTT for the purpose of alleviating the hardships that the people of the eastern province were suffering. Many of the areas that were devastated by tsunami were areas controlled by the LTT. So without some working arrangement with the LTT, it was not possible to deliver relief to the people of the affected areas. So President Kumarapalli felt that there could not be a stronger impetus than this. This is as strong an impetus as one could desire for a collaborative arrangement between the government and the LTT. A lot of effort went into that, and one of the contributions that the Norwegian facilitators made was that they insisted that the Muslim representatives must play a significant role. With regard to the talks that took place in several foreign capitals, there were 6 rounds of talks in all. Norway, Germany, Oslo, Hakone, Tokyo, Hakone, Japan, and so on. And because of the insistence of the LTT, the process was binary. There were just 2 parties, not 3 parties. The LTT insisted that the Muslims could not be accommodated as a party. It could not become tripartite. It had to be a bilateral process between the government of Sri Lanka and the LTT. But when it came to the pre-terms agreement, the Norwegians said no. The Muslims were very much affected by tsunami, and therefore the Muslims do have a right. They have locus standi in that situation, and the Norwegian ambassador at that time, Hans Bratska, played a very significant role in ensuring the accommodation of Muslim interests with regard to the preparation of the But that too failed. And that failed because, see, the the JVP, which is now in power in Sri Lanka, that is the current government of Sri Lanka, they had at that time about 35 members of parliament in President Kumaratunga's time. And President Kumaratunga had offered them 3 4. The present president of Sri Lanka was Minister of Agriculture in Kumaratunga's government. But the JVP said, we will have nothing to do with this P-terms agreement that you are negotiable. And if you sign it, the very next day, we will walk out of your government, which they did. Not only did they walk out of the government, but they challenged the entire P-terms agreement before the Supreme Court of the They said this agreement is contrary to the Constitution. And they wanted the agreement to be knocked out in total. The Chief Justice of Sri Lanka and another judge who constituted the bench rejected the argument. They said the entirety of the agreement cannot be considered repugnant to the Constitution of Sri Lanka. But they struck down in an interim order. They struck down a particular part of the P-terms agreement, which purported to establish a regional committee. A regional committee was a part of the P-terms agreement. Because the regional committees have the power to decide on disbursement of funds, allocation of projects. The nitty-gritty of the whole thing was tied up with the functions of the regional committee. Now, the Supreme Court said, the Constitution of Sri Lanka declares in Article 148 that Parliament shall be the sole authority with regard to public finance. Parliament of Sri Lanka, nobody else. It's a non-delegable function. So, the regional committee, therefore, was exercising functions which belong to Parliament and Parliament alone. So it was a kind of usurpation of Parliament's power with regard to public finance, which the court refused to countenance. So that was struck down. But after the FTP lost interest in the P-terms agreement, because that was the substantial part of it. Then that unfortunately created a feeling not only among the LTT, but in the Tamil community, minorities in general, that if Sri Lanka's constitutional systems militated against purposive and fruitful collaboration, even in the face of a calamity as far-reaching as tsunami, then what chance is there to evolve a satisfactory arrangement within the four corners of the existing concept? So there was a kind of despondency which set in, that would not have been greater urgency than in this situation. But even in the throes of a crisis of that magnitude, the parties failed to come to some understanding with regard to something as well as a delivery of aid to the people who are affected by something. So in that case, is there an insuperable obstacle, an unsurmountable obstacle for a constitutional solution? So these are some of the issues that I thought worth discussing with you. Looking back on it, the question has been put to me, was this worth attempt? Could this possibly have succeeded? Or was it predestined to failure, doomed to failure? Looking back on it all in an objective and dispassionate spirit, I think that it was not predestined to fail, but there were many supervening circumstances which imposed a very heavy strain on the process. Some of those constraints were domestic, others were international. Domestically, there were two rival centers of power within the government of Sri Lanka, the president and the prime minister, heading to rival political parties in the run-up to a presidential election. So adversarial attitudes trumped broader national aspirations, that is within the country. Externally, 9/11 made a world of difference. And the Norwegian official told me that they did not envisage the degree of difficulty they would be required to encounter in the aftermath of 9/11. So that made, home ministries in many European countries became far more powerful than foreign ministries. So that brought about an exceedingly hostile environment in which it was next to impossible for the Norwegians to play the constructive role. So there were many things that went wrong, some to do with personal idiosyncrasies, something to do with political, sometimes with political exigencies and so on. But I do believe that differently handled with regard to some of those aspects, and had the LTT shown some degree of flexibility. See, the problem was, with regard to the Indian adopted world, the fundamental problem was that Prabhakaran was convinced of his military invincibility. And in a personal conversation, I asked Anton Balasingham, I had got to know him quite well outside the conference floor. And I once asked him, this has all the appearance of a Greek tragedy. We know where this will end up. With the decimation, the total destruction of the LTT. But there is still a very limited window of opportunity. Why don't you make use? He reflected for a moment or two and he told me, I have nothing to reproach myself with because I have made every conceivable attempt to convince my leader that some form of negotiation with myself. But by that time, the leader, Prabhakaran, had begun to entertain some suspicions of Balasingham himself. Because as is not unusual in any power structure, there are others who are jealous of Balasingham's special relationship with the leader as principal ideologue. Right? He was the only person on the LTT side who understood the issue. He was a political scientist. All the others were so-and-so. So he had done his level best. But by that time, his access to Prabhakaran was also limited. His wife, Adele Balasingham, was a hospital nurse. And she did not want Balasingham to spend long periods in Sri Lanka. And she insisted that the visit should be short and infrequent. And others made use of that opportunity to bring about some kind of alienation between Balasingham and his leader. So he told me, I have done all I possibly can. If I am sailing pretty close to the wind, if I do anything more, my own life will be in jeopardy. So this unshakable conviction on the part of Prabhakaran that Sri Lankan army might win a battle or two, a skirmish or two, but it was absolutely impossible for them to win the war. So why make significant concessions? This was the principal obstacle to any form of progress in the Sri Lankan peace process. So I will stop there in order to give you the opportunity of making comments or putting any questions to me. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Perez. Now, you've given us a lot to chew on, and it's indeed a perspective from inside, and you've given us a ringside view of the issues that came up, the challenges, etc. I'm sure all of us have a lot of questions. I have quite a few as well, but I don't want to hog the floor. So I'm going to ask you one broad question and we'll open up, and if I get a chance, I'll come back in again. You ended on trying. You threw up the question of whether this was doomed to fail. One of the critiques of peace processes often is that there's a disjuncture between the elite negotiations and public awareness of what's going on and public support. In hindsight, looking back, do you feel that there was enough effort from both sides to gain public legitimacy, to educate the public about what this process was all about? And do you think something could have been done differently?
No, I think that's a very important issue because when I was writing the book, I enlisted the services of a Tamil-speaking journalist. He was working for the Veera Kesari, it's a well-known newspaper in the north of the country. And that was a very significant failure. That is insufficient interaction with the public. That is one of the main reasons why, when there was so much positive sentiment at the beginning, that sentiment very rapidly evaporated. That was really the fault of the government of power. The Norwegians on several occasions did point out the need for better and more intense communication. But that is not really happening. A good example is the subcommittee on gender issue, women's suffering. Did some valuable work, but the problem was the LTTE is now both the government and the LTTE nominated women from an elitist background. The government delegation consisted of people who were very committed, worked very hard, but they represented Colombo society. The LTT Women's Committee was headed by Adele Balz. Adele Balz, right. The others were also soldiers in the LTT setup. So, as one civil society activist in the north asked, what do these people know about the suffering of women? And, because of the deaths of so many men, there were female-headed families, and it was not just a question of finding incomes, but there was huge emotional and social vacuum. And but nobody really familiar with the suffering of the women in the north and who could articulate their difficulties with authenticity. They were not there at all. So this was seen as something distant and elitist and, as you said, disconnected from society. So this was one of the problems. One of the structural weaknesses of the process is that it did not make sufficient provision for constant interaction with the community at large, and it became the public perception of it more and more withdrawn.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor and I'm going to go with the first hand that I see. So I saw Sandeep's hand first. So there's a roving mic.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful and very systematic remarks. Thank you very much for your. Right. Well, I'm in awe of how systematically you thought about the whole thing. I have one small question, one big question. Small one is about the role of Thailand. Was it just a location where people met, or was there some other role that Thailand also played in this conflict?
No role at all. It was a responsibility of the Norwegians to find venues for the peace talks. So for the very first meeting, Thailand was chosen for many reasons. So logistically, it was convenient. Balasingham in particular had difficulty in traveling long distances because of his health problem. So Thailand was convenient. It was felt that as an Asian country, with the cultural mores and so on, were very close to the culture of Sri Lanka. And the Norwegians had discussions with the Royal Thai government, and the Thai government placed at the disposal of Norwegians naval. It was really a naval camp called Sattahip. It was about 40 kilometers south of Bangkok. The Thai government played no substantive role at all. They never paid the venue. They had a lot of problems like this. The very first meeting, it's described by Eric Solheim. Eric Solheim said, we had this problem of the seating arrangements. Who was going to speak first? So he eventually decided that I would speak first as the representative of the government of Sri Lanka, but he wanted to give the LTTE a central seating position to protect them. The Thai government objected to that. And then also there was a problem with regard to the flags. The Sri Lankan flag, the tiger flag, and the Thai flag. Now, there were problems about using the LTT flag at all because the LTT was a banned organization. Finally, it was decided after discussion with the Thais insisted on protocol. They had no other role, but they said you have to do things properly, you have to do things in accordance with our protocol procedures. So they objected to the LTT flag being used at all. And finally, the Norwegians had to decide that there would be no flags at all. No Sri Lankan flag, no Thai flag, no, all flags were. So that the flags that were more deeper or greater.
Um, and I have a social method. Now that the war is over, how you spoke a lot about what you thought or the government thought, what LTP was thinking at the moment. How was that determined by the government? I mean, I imagine there were a lot of sources. There must be intelligence reports. There must be what negotiators and Anton Policing is saying. There must be public statements from LTT, but it's a secretive organization. What, which sources did you place at higher premium? Which were the best ways to understand what LTT was thinking, how its decision making?
Well, I did not meet Prabhakaran on any occasion at all. I have never met him face to face and spoken with him. So our contact was entirely through his delegation. And in his delegation, there was a kind of division of labor. Military matters were handled by Tamil Selva. And when it came to discussion of the high security zones, it was very difficult. The LTT said we can't remove the high security zones until there is a political agreement. The army said there is no way that we can dismantle or even reduce the size of the high security zones unless there is a firm agreement on the part of the LTT to decommission their heavy weapons. Right? Now, these kinds of issues were entirely within the purview of Tamil Selvam. And at the discussions at the negotiating table, Balasingham would defer to Tamil Selvam in respect of military issues. Political issues, Balasingham was in sole charge. One of the members of the LTA delegation was Karuna. You know, people who say this peace process is a waste of time. Shouldn't have been done at all. See, the Karuna defection was the greatest calamity that the LTT experienced in their whole history. Karuna walked away. And with him, he took all the cadres in the eastern province. Now, Karuna said, you know, the Norwegians had, one of their initiatives had been to arrange for the LTT to visit European countries, particularly the Nordic countries. Right? So they did a lot of traveling. And then they went so far as to arrange with the University of Bradford in England to provide a course for the LTT on federalism, to initiate them into the niceties of federalism, to remove these inhibitions from their minds. And they had the feeling the Sri Lanka government has all the expertise, they have none. So there was this very defensive feeling on their part. The Norwegians wanted to do something about it. So then Karuna said, this travel opened my eyes to a world outside the jungles of the one. So that is one of the reasons. That is not the only reason. There are other reasons also. The fathers from the Vani felt that they were consistently getting stepmotherly treatment. All the plums were for the fathers who were. But then the Karuna defection, in all probability, would not have occurred but for the peace process. If there was no peace process at all, the Karuna defection would not have occurred. In any case, the attitude of the international community, the government of Sri Lanka, would have been very different if there had been obstinate refusal by the government to engage in any peace process at all. If they had taken up the television war and nothing but war, and if there had been calcitrant in that approach, then the hostility of the international community would have been taken advantage of. So that's the answer. We had to be guided by what was stated at the table and other communication. But beyond that, we had no access to the leadership.
Okay.
Very fascinating and interesting insider view on the peace process. I was just wondering if it would be happening currently, what do you think would be similar or different in terms of the approaches and the environment if this thing would be happening like the current age? Because in the last 25 years, there has been a massive change in the world and a lot of other things related. Thank you.
The current environment, the entity would certainly not found it, they would not have found it possible to adopt the very hard, unyielding postures that were characteristic of them at that time. But if you're asking me what we would have done differently, okay. There was some degree of trust. Now, President Kumaratunga was the executive president. Ranil Wickremesinghe was the prime minister. They belonged to different political parties and had very different views, very different world views and very different views about domestic Sri Lankan politics as well. Kumaratunga's attitude for the entity was this. She wanted to embark on what she called a war for peace. War for peace was a policy of Chandrika Kumaratunga. What she meant by that was now she once told me in a conversation, at the end of the day, there would still be a rump within the LTTE that would not agree to any form of conflict. So she wanted the war, but that was to be directed against that hardcore, which was not large in terms of numbers. So the war was really for them. But she was very, very keen on winning over the Tamil people. That is very important, the distinction in her mind between the Tamil people and the LTT. So she had a multi-pronged, dual-pronged approach. I was in charge of the constitutional arena. And up to now, the most comprehensive, the most elaborate set of constitutional proposals relating to devolution of power were embodied in the draft constitution, which I presented to Parliament on her behalf on the 3rd of August in the year 2000. That's the constitutional, the legal part. Okay? But my colleague, the Honorable Mangala Samarendi, was in charge of what was called the Sudu Nenum movement, the White Lotus. The epitome of the White Lotus movement was Chandrika's conviction of bring people together, convince the people that the Sinhalese and the Tamil are not in common. What divides us is far, far less important than what unites us. So she wanted to start with the schools, sports teams, debating teams from there, to weld these two together in lots of imaginative ways. So that was Chandrika Kumaratunga's approach. But all the time she regarded the LTT as an adversary. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, on the other hand, regarded the LTT as a partner. We work together. So there was a lot of confidence that in the end that the LTT would come round, and this obduracy would not characterize the talks throughout their duration. As we get to know them, as we talk to them, as we make progress, there will be a greater resilience, which never happened. For the reason I gave you earlier, because it's unshakable conviction on the part of Prabhakaran relating to military Indian speech. So if we had to do it again, I think much earlier in the piece, we would demand more stable assurances with regard to final settlement. Before we consider interim solution and other things, we say, let's have at least a broad outline of where we are going to end up. We have a very clear picture in our own mind. Now let's hear your views on that, and let's see whether there is some degree of congruity between these different approaches. I think we would place much more emphasis on that at an earlier stage of the process, but it didn't happen because it was felt, it would demand too much and it would appear to be insensitive, no finesse. Then that itself would be a problem. So a lot of latitude was given to the So that proved to be an error of judgment. And in any case, if we were doing it today, that is certainly an area where our thinking would be different.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left. I see 3 hands. So could I ask that the questions be kept brief and then we can have a response? And if it's okay, can I put all 3 together and then the response? Ganesh first.
for that very insightful, very detailed, nuanced talk. I was just wondering if you could comment on, what has happened since 2009, because the word peace also comes with reconciliation. So if you could move forward and just reflect on what has happened in relation to that. Thank you.
Regarding the coroner's defect, did you think it had a very significant effect on the peace process? Because was LTT even homogeneous even prior to that? And if they were not, because there was already factions, would the Karna split have any significant effect? Did that lead towards the fall of the peace process?
I think these two questions, first, and then I'll take two more questions. So,
Yeah, with regard to reconciliation, the war ended in May 2009, but nobody would suggest that all the problems went away with the end of the war. There are lingering issues which are still very much with us. The present government is committed to the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You spoke of reconciliation. But all governments have been talking of reconciliation. Nothing of a pragmatic nature has really happened. So we have asked, some of us representing civil society have asked, be clear in your mind about what you mean by reconciliation. There is a lot of aura around the South African TRC, but that would obviously not work in Sri Lanka. It was basically a Christian concept, a catharsis, purging of the soul, and the expiation of guilt by making a clean breast of it all. There were two pillars of it. One was confession, and the other was amnesty. Amnesty was dependent upon sincere total confession, contrition. That is not going to work. And what exactly have you in mind? In South Africa, the perpetrators and the victims were brought together in a truth, in an adventure seeking truth. But is it at all realistic to ask the Sri Lankan army, the armed forces and victims to come? Would not. Politically, it would not be considered expedient by any government. So what would you then do? It's not just South Africa, that are Latin American countries which have been very successful. But so far, there has not been anything of a definite nature which has been proposed, apart from lip service to nebulous aspirations. Right? So definitely there is need for reconciliation. There is a need for some formal instrument, but its nature needs to be spelled out. The second question about Karuna, definitely it made a huge difference. The war would have gone on for much longer had the Karuna defection not occurred. But the Karuna defection cannot be seen as one single event. There were things happening leading up to that. Not the alienation of the eastern cadres from the northern cadres. When Karuna for some time had been active, building up a power center of his own. So the Vanni had limited control over Karuna and Karuna's cadres. And later on, he lived in Colombo. He served in various capacities connected with the government and so on. He enjoyed the highlight. He enjoyed the fresh pots and so on. So the peace process gave him exposure to things which he later derived great enjoyment from doing. But in terms of the sequence of the process, the Karuna defection was certainly, by any standard, a very significant event.
last two questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Paris. Okay, I just want to ask, what was Raw's involvement in the whole peace process? Because it is known, Raw, Research and Analysis Wing, because it is known in the early days, Raw actually trained the LTT. And can I ask one more question? It involves okay. And also, what was Sri Lankan's intelligence services
working with Singapore on the diaspora funding of the Tamil pilots. The diaspora, the funding? Yeah.
Well, I mean, many countries helped us. I won't go into details about the nature of the assistance that was given by different countries. RAW, yes, they played a role. See, their problem all along was that they did not want to, they did not want a highly visible profile. That would create problems internally. But towards the end, when an airstrip was discovered in the one, the LTT even had incipient aerial capability. They had an airstrip and a plane of sorts. At that point, the Indian government, they agreed to help us with intelligence, both India and the United States. Helped with intelligence relating to the floating armories of the LTT, large ships bringing up. They had the large ships coming. Then from the mothership, they had smaller vessels bringing the armies into Sri Lanka. And thanks to intelligence placed at the Sri Lanka government's disposal by India and the United States, we were able to blow up a large vessel off the coast of Indonesia. Sri Lanka did not have the technology to do that, and that was possible because of Indian intelligence working together with the United States.
We started 2 minutes late, so Ravi, I'm going to give you the last. You speak to the mic with the light.
A couple of things that you didn't elaborate too much.
Yeah.
How did Indian attitudes change after May 31, 1991, when Rajiv was murdered?
Yeah.
And secondly, I'm completely with you when you say that the LTT, at the end of the day, Prabhakaran was inflexible. My own impression is that all those peace talks would have meant nothing at the end of the day because he would not have signed off on it until he got exactly what he wanted. Because for the same reason that you mentioned, that he thought that it was within his reach all the time until his death. But the other thing is that even, let's say, they had some sort of chance to clinch it, would the Buddhist clergy have allowed it from the majority community?
It goes to questions, yes, the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi changed the entire landscape. Until then, the government of Srimati Indira Gandhi was supportive of the United States, financially, in terms of military training and so on. So that is one. That was as a kind of counter to President the relationship between those two leaders was not good between President Shahjahan and Prime Minister. So she nurtured the LTT in the early stages, hoping that she could control the LTT. The LTT would be an instrument in the hands of the Indian government. But then you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once you create the genie determines its own future and no external power. So that lesson was learned later. The watershed event, of course, was the assassination of the Prime Minister. The second question, the influence of Buddhist clergy, you can see, even if some agreement had been arrived at in the end, would the Buddhist clergy have been able to stultify it all? That, of course, it cannot be taken for granted that the Buddhist clergy would have some kind of absolute veto power, right? No, that would be an oversimplification. Even now, you are probably aware of some tensions, particularly in the eastern province of Sri Lanka with regard to archaeological sites and Buddhist temples and so on. So that influence is very much there, but there are other moderating factors. So if there had been an agreement which was thought by the vast mass of opinion in the country to be sensible and productive, beneficial, then enlightened public opinion would have played a key role in extenuating, in mitigating some of the sentiments of the risk regime. But unfortunately, we didn't get as far.
Professor Perez, thank you so much for what I can only describe as a rich, insightful, but also, if I may say, candid and very honest talk, which I'm sure has answered some questions, but also given rise to more questions in our mind as we think through not just the Sri Lankan peace process, but our peace processes that need to take place in other parts of the world as well. So could you please all join me to thank Dr. Perez for his time. I look forward to welcoming you back to ISEF again. I'm sure Dr. Perez, Professor Perez will be willing to share his thoughts if anybody has a question or we have a little time. So maybe we can adjourn outside the room. So.